broader view of water markets, my previous scholarship focused just on exchange of water rights, I am trying to identify which are the potential negative consequences of these water markets and how we could address them from a regulatory perspective within, the current system. What are the incremental changes that we could implement in order to address some potential negative consequences for efficient, having in mind that the goals for water management could be just efficiency or efficiency and fairness, depending on what the jurisdiction aims at. So let me walk you through these different negative consequences that I have identified. The first one, it's kind of hard to put your finger on, because it's a similar situation of the grandson who kills his grandfather and wants to inherit from him. So you have a lot of energy companies that have contributed to climate change that now are benefiting from investing in water. So they benefit from their own wrong, and whether we could address that or not. And I hardly see a situation where we could address it, because that will imply that we are limiting who can hold a water right, and that seems like a difficult task to undertake. The second set of negative effects deals with the communities of origins. This new and expanded version of water markets implies that the decision-making power over water will be far away from the community of origin. And while many economists, and I am sure there are a lot of those in the room, think that pecuniary externalities should not be taken into account, and there is no difference between a manufacturing company in the Rust Belt moving to China than there is...
I don't know what's going on with that.
That's okay. Than a bunch of farmers selling water to a city and the agricultural region suffering as a result of that. Truth is, in many instances when we have had water transactions, we have tried to address those community effects. Be it that there will be fewer jobs because there will be a reduced economic activity, because you need a transitional period where you diversify the economy and so on. And we can think about some sort of taxing the transaction so that you get some funds in order to implement that transition. And I review some of the different experiences in the paper. The third group deals with the fear that water markets will translate into a higher price for water. And that's actually something that we should rejoice on, because in general, water is underpriced. We don't price the scarcity value. The only thing that we are paying for is transportation costs. So we all should embrace the idea that if water is more expensive, we are all going to be more mindful, we are going to take shorter showers. But that also means that poor communities may have less access to water, and that we should account for ways to make sure that we guarantee a certain level of access. And that doesn't mean that we should say no to markets, right? The percentage that we need to cover our basic needs is about 2% of the amount of water that we use, so there is room to implement a sort of voucher system or a tiered pricing system that will mitigate those potential pitfalls. The fourth group is something that it's a fear, and it has happened in other natural resource markets, which is the fear that this expanded water market, if you want, will be a market with very few actors, that you will have the big international water companies deciding everything, because they will somehow manage to integrate both horizontally and vertically, right? The Bechtels, the Veolias, and the Suez Lyonnais of the world will be the ones deciding the fate of our water. And normally, we shouldn't really care about that. We have antitrust law that should deal with some of these effects, but in many natural resources we have tried, almost always not very successfully, to implement restrictions within the regulation of the natural resource about how much rights over the resource or who can hold the right over the resource in order to prevent that from happening. And the last set of negative effects is something that I believe, or part of them, everyone would agree on, no matter whether you have in mind that water management goals should only be efficiency or we should also take into account distributional consequences. The reason why I think everybody will agree is because what I try to tackle in that group are situations where these new investments in water are profiting from regulatory gaps and are creating negative externalities that are not being accounted for because these new investments sidestep the traditional water market rules. To give you an example, if groundwater is not regulated and surface water is, and people start investing in groundwater, then there will be clear effects on surface water if those two are connected, and nobody will be held accountable because of that. Another example may be water reuse. How property rights in water in private appropriation estates are defined is that you know the amount that you can divert from the river. The majority of users don't consume 100% of that amount. They return a lot of that water to the river. And the majority of our western rivers have been overallocated. That means that the agencies have allocated that return flow to someone else. However, if you can reuse all the water, there is nothing that prevents you from now consuming 100% of the water that before you were returning to the river. So it's unclear whether we should deal or not with the potential negative effects for people downstream. But at least we should know that this may happen. And within this group of effects, I also tackle one that it's, again, difficult to put your finger on, so somehow this is circular, which is the idea that some of these new investments go against the ethos of private appropriation. Private appropriation water rights systems have built-in protections against speculation. The idea that you have to use your water right, that the right has to put to beneficial use, and so on. So you should not be able to just sit on your water right for pure speculative purposes, right? You should not be able to just hold water in order to sell it somewhere else. And somehow, the new investments in water are sidestepping those prohibitions, and whether we should find ways to address those. And some potential way could be, again, limiting the amount of water that each right holder can have, maybe a way to discourage these big companies from entering into these investments. You can imagine building on some sort of requirement that once you invest in water, you have to put it to use for a certain number of years before you can transfer it. But I go through several proposals in the paper. So the areas that I am doubtful about how to address are the following. The first one is the definition of water markets itself. It is clear that water markets are the exchange of surface water rights, and that's what I am very familiar with. Here I am trying to adopt a broader definition, but I am not sure how far I should go. Should I incorporate the idea of, and what the Great Lakes have had a lot of cases of that, of bottled water, and how we transport that water out of the basin, and whether that's different than raw use of water, or should I not? Then the second issue I am struggling with is how to present the potential negative effects. Because some of those address distributional concerns, some others address efficiency, some others some hybrid of the two. And you can also think of a different classification, could be more tangible versus more intangible effects, and how could you prefer to see that. And then the last one, and I hope it comes across in the paper, and if not, I have to make it clear, is that we have a lot of legal literature on water markets, mostly the exchange of water rights. And you have polarized, if you want, groups, someone that believes that markets should be the only management system for natural resources, someone who believes we should never commodify water and any other natural resource. And there is a group in between that aims at, well, water markets are a useful tool, so let's see how we can make them work, but they are not the only tool. But then if you take one step further and look at the broader literature on water markets encompassing all these other forms of investment that I have mentioned, there is a lot of what I call mass market academic literature, all these books about water for sale and whatnot. And that one seems to be extremely polarized, just looking at, hey, this is what, you should completely be against corporations having an interest in water, or we should just give, just have a free market for water. But the in-between group that is very present in the exchange of surface water rights seems to be less represented in this broader analysis of water markets, and that's what I am trying to do with this piece. So with that, the floor is yours, and I look forward to any comment you may have.
Okay, thank you. So I'll keep track of the queue, so just...
And I know it's going to be recorded, but I still like to get some notes. And if you could tell me your name so that I can follow up if need be, that would be great.
So I'll keep track of the queue and let me know. Yeah, go ahead. I'll just signal I'll keep track.
Nick Snow, I'm in the economics department. Apologize if this is in here and I just missed it. But I kind of want to see more economic approach to this. I teach economics and regulation, and I always tell my students, I'm going to come across very free market sounding, but it's a false dichotomy to say to regulate or not to regulate.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you regulate? Markets work well when they work, right? But if you don't have the proper property right structure, you can't have that. So what I'm kind of wondering is, what is in the water markets? What are the transaction costs? So Harold Depp says, why don't we see the proper property rights that facilitate the markets, therefore requiring certain regulations? And that's kind of what I'd like to see more of. What is going on that we're kind of seeing a blockage of this? The other thing, the other comment that kind of was coming to my head is you talk about the special interests in terms of these large corporations, but what I don't really see is if we are going to regulate, how are we going to kind of stop them from capturing these regulations? They have a very big interest. Once we do regulate, some are going to gain at the expense of others, and this gives them kind of a strong incentive to attempt to capture these regulations and turn it to their own end. So I guess those are my two big concerns: is why not more markets? If it is that, what are the transaction costs that are stopping it? And then how do you stop the special interest concerns within the regulations that you're kind of proposing?
So I don't know what is the code. Should I respond or should I collect questions?
I think you should respond.
Okay.
That would be the best.
So, there is a huge literature about transaction costs in water markets. I think that the main challenge, and I was talking this morning with Rob about this, is the no injury rule that you don't find exactly stated in any other market that I can think of. So for most transactions, except if we are talking about very old water rights, and even then the same applies, but it will be in front of the judge instead of in front of an agency, you have to ask for approval. If you ever want to see something extremely complicated, there is a decision tree that the California State Water Resource Control Board puts in order to tell you the different approvals that you have to go through if you want to enter into a water transaction, that gives you a sense of the amount of transaction costs that you have to go through. This no injury rule doesn't really mean no injury. It means that you cannot injure junior or other water users. About the environment, it's a little bit more wishy-washy. But that would be, like a great source of transaction costs. That are transaction costs that come from regulation. There are other set of transaction costs that just come from the very nature of water.
And I guess that's the one I'm concerned or wondering about. Right?
Yeah. So I think
I imagine they exist.
I was thinking whether I should have like a sort of section that would be, why is water market resistant? Right? And one is that water is local in itself, right? It's very expensive to transport. So to give you an example, it's one case I mentioned in the paper. Devon Pickens, an old tycoon, buys a lot of groundwater in the Panhandle in Texas, thinking we are going to sell it to the big, expanding metropolitan areas in Texas. He gets, special interest. He gets the Texas legislature to pass a statute allowing him to have eminent domain. But he doesn't find anyone that wants to buy it because it's too expensive, right? That there are other sources of water that would be cheaper. So water is market resistant because it tends to be more local, just because it's too expensive to transport and so on. And then it's also market resistant because we have built in these protections about, the no injury rule. Then again, if you can find places where groundwater is not regulated, you sidestep those. That implies that you may have more active market, but that doesn't mean that you have a market with fewer externalities. And then about the special interest, I don't know if I am that concerned about big corporations, and the reason is farmers have been great in every single jurisdiction I can think of, and it doesn't matter the U.S. I think everywhere I can think of that I have looked at their water system, and I did this thing for the Food and Agricultural Organization, but looking at different countries, and all of them seem to have, a great deal of path dependence. Maybe it's path dependence, but they are really locked in, and the agricultural sector has the oldest water rights, the majority of water rights, and then tend to be very good at protecting them. So I am not sure, and it may be that I am not sure how the political economy has to change for Bechtel to be able to overpower those. And then also, we are thinking about farmers as we have this individual farmer that grows his crop and we want to protect him, but there is also a lot of agribusiness that rival any of these big water corporations.
Lee, and then queue's open, so.
Yeah, so this is a good follow-up on Nick, that I was thinking, well, what would Ronald Coase say? And he would say, I think, first of all, make sure these property rights to water are secure, and then how high are the transaction costs? And as you said somewhere in the paper, what you really want is water to flow to its highest valued user. That's what we think is efficient, and in the public interest in general. But then you've got all these caveats. And I think that would be a nice way to structure it, that, okay, if we just let it go, what would be the negative effects and what do we want to protect? And I think, at least when I was in Colorado, one of my colleagues, Chuck Howe, was working on water markets a lot. And he said the real problem was that farmers were too afraid to sell their water because they thought they'd lose their right, even though under prior appropriation they shouldn't lose that right. So, and I know about some water exchanges in California where it was really complicated, where you could only sell the amount that you could get from drip irrigation, and that you didn't fallow any land. But meanwhile, if you're out there, one, you see all these irrigation going to alfalfa, really low valued crop. Or, what in the hell are we doing growing rice in California that could use the water elsewhere instead of flooding these fields, and half of it evaporates. I read more water evaporates off California rice fields than is consumed in San Francisco area. Mm-hmm. So this doesn't make sense to economists. So,
certainly.
In a way, it's that maybe the rights really aren't secure enough, and that's why farmers are reluctant, and politicians certainly don't like it, because then you could get depopulation, which you kind of hint at a little bit. But if everybody's selling their water, and then they can just go to the Caribbean and live off their as a rentier. Do we want that, or are people? But he said people were really afraid that if they sold their water, they might lose it.
So that's true, and that's a constant, again, across jurisdictions, that people feel, well, in prior appropriation you are required to put water to beneficial use.
Right.
The reluctance that they feel about selling water is that as soon as I sell the water, I am giving the message to the agency, I don't need this water, right. They are going to come and curtail it. And California has passed several amendments, and Gary Liebercat has a paper testing the effect of those amendments, actually saying, hey, sell your water, we are not or lease it, we are not going to come after you. But that were not really effective. The only thing that I have seen, and I have not been able to gather enough data about this, but anecdotal evidence seems to suggest is whenever the agency has acted as a broker, somehow the agency has been involved in the transaction as a part of the transaction, farmers have been less reluctant because somehow it's like they are, I don't know, like putting their stamp on it and know that they will not go after. So there seems to be a quantitative change in California regarding transactions before and after the Water Bank of 1991, which is like a agency-sponsored water exchange center, so that you will sell your water for a specified price, and then they will sell it to someone who wants to buy it for a higher price. And the difference between those prices are just the administrative costs. So that's one thing. So if we want water markets to work, probably we should find ways that carrots or sticks that will prompt those farmers to overcome that resistance to sell it in the market. Because as it is, right, if we think that prior appropriation has built in, and I don't think it successfully has those built in, but some people claim, right, these mechanisms to control for inefficient uses of water, and you are allowing them to sell what before was a wasteful use by implementing DRIP and sell the surplus, that's a carrot right there for them to become more efficient. So that is not enough, so what else do we need to set up in place to overcome that? There is so property rights are secure or not. Let me put it differently, and I have always struggled with this. You could always define property rights more finely. But more finely doesn't mean that they would really be more transferable, particularly if you have the no injury rule, right? Because that will trigger more variables to take them into account. In addition, I think I always have felt the following, and again, this is something that I believe cuts across jurisdictions, which is normal water management favors the agricultural sector because of path dependence, interest groups, whatnot. Whenever we reach a situation of real crisis, in general, we tend to make sure that urban areas don't go without water, because those are where the boats are, right? So we will find mechanisms to solve that. California deviated from this in the last crisis because it set up residential use restrictions almost everywhere. And that's the counterexample to what I'm gonna to this idea. So property rights are secure, but emergency measures may be trumping incentives at the end. I also want to highlight something. Colorado is slightly different than the other states in how property rights are defined, because even though they have the office of the state engineer and the power of the state engineer has increased, it has a system that is based on the water course, so it may be, you could say that the property rights are, and this is a very vague way to put it, a little bit more secure, because they are less based on permit systems than other states.
Right.
We'll have an open queue, so I will jump in here. So, but please fill in. So the paper's 55 pages, and you've got two really short concluding paragraphs. I'm trying to figure out what's the takeaway message here. Is it that the system we have in the U.S. and other places is being shaken up by new increasing values, and the institutions are going to get worse or better, or what? I was looking for some sort of summary of what you found here. If you could do that for us.
Yes. So I do think that current investment in water presents challenges that the historical way we have managed water cannot respond to. And then what we have to ask is, how do we want the water rights system or the water law to respond to those? And your answer to that will depend on what are the goals that you believe that water management should, should aim at. If you are someone, and I assume that's true for you, that just want an efficient management, then probably you will have to only implement some of the portfolio of measures that are scattered right now on the paper. But you may also want to build in some distributional concern protections and I have some recipes for that too. So I think to an extent the new investments and this new, renewed, whatever you want to call it, interest in investing in water will require at least some adaptation. Whether you are willing to do more or less will depend on which interest end up winning and losing in this. But it's true that no matter where you stand, there are some of the proposals here that you should be willing to embrace, just because some of the current investments are profiting from gaps in the regulation, right? There is no scientist that will agree that you can have a system for surface water that is based on permits and so on, and no system for groundwater. And this is not, I am sure everyone has heard about Texas having rule of capture on groundwater, and Texas may be weird and have this approach to property that a lot of people believe and so on. But even California, that's supposed to be at the forefront of environmental regulations, has a very complex water law system, doesn't have or didn't have a system regulated groundwater. And even today, the system that regulates groundwater, it's very weak. So for a long time, they didn't have any real regulation at the state level of groundwater. The last crisis prompted them to do so because, of course, if groundwater is not regulated and you establish limits on the surface water use, what people are going to do is drill down and pump out water. And what they did is kick the can down the road, saying, well, there will be these new consortiums at the local level that will be formed, and they will find a way to regulate this local commons. And maybe that's great because you will have different systems and they will work very well, but that gives them a deadline of 2025, I think, to complete the plans, and I may be off on the date, so don't quote me on that. But, like, for example, that is something that needs to be done, no matter what. But it's becoming more acute given this new interest in, transferring water from here to out of the basin.
Yeah, we have a couple of people, just gentleman first and
Luis and Alejandra from the Resilience Institute.
Yeah, you go ahead.
you can decide who goes first.
Okay. I'm Maria Mastales and I'm from Indiana Geological and Water Survey. And I'm thinking about your negative consequences of water market and the groups that you put them in. And I'm a geologist and work with resources, so I'm also thinking about the availability of water. And obviously on a national level, we mentioned California, obviously the problem of water over there is totally different than here in Indiana, that sometimes I feel I have too much water and wish I didn't have that much. But do you think that those consequences would be different depending upon the availability, or which would be similar, or could they be sometimes kind of opposite, so almost on a national level canceling out?
Okay, so several reactions. The first one is we only worry when there is not enough, right? We in general think about the solutions to scarcity. And that's actually what I am always interested in. I wrote a piece about parking based on the same idea, right? That you can apply scarcity regulations to almost anything. So obviously, the West faces different challenges that, say, Michigan. However, that was true, right? The difference between the East and the West of the United States were very blatant. And that's why you have a regime in the East that is inspired by the riparianism in England, where you have a lot of water available. And then the West is, there is less than 100 inches of rainfall a year, and you need a different system. So the law has responded to that. Now the differences are kind of watering down because particularly in the Southeast, scarcity has started to be a problem and they have to respond to that. So obviously, you are gonna have different needs of different regulatory needs in Indiana than you will have in California. Still, I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever to regulate, to not regulate the whole water cycle comprehensively, right? That to regulate surface water and groundwater separate. However, regulation is costly. So you will not undertake any change if you don't have, if water is not valuable enough. And if you have enough water, you will probably not go and think what is the best system and why we shouldn't establish a permit system for groundwater in Indiana. Then whether it cancels out or not at the national level, this goes back to Nick's comment about, or that I frame as water being market resistant because of the same nature of the resource. California has a northern part that is very wet and a southern part that is dry. And you have a lot of human-built infrastructure that connects the north and the south, and it creates a lot of environmental consequences. And then you have alfalfa being grown. And alfalfa is always tricky because people look at water and why we allow that to happen. But the main thing is if you subsidize dairy and cows eat alfalfa, you will have alfalfa. So you have to, if you want to solve the problem, there are more fronts. So, and then they solve it, right? Somehow, California doesn't have enough water when there is a drought, but somehow it cancels out within the state. I assume, and I have not looked at this, but if you look at the overall water availability in the US and the overall water needs, you probably could transfer water from the Great Lakes to the west and you will soften the problem. But transferring water is very expensive and and there are a lot of political costs, right? Just to give you a similar example, or something that I believe will illustrate this point. The Colorado River. In the Colorado River, you have a treaty in the mid-20th century, divides water across, a treaty with Mexico, but Mexico is clearly screwed up on that treaty, never mind. The 7 states in the US where the Colorado crosses, they decide on an allocation between upper basin and lower basin. At that point, you could think about different criteria to allocate water in a shared river. You could say the number of population. You could say the amount of basin territory that is in a particular state. But at the end of the day, it ends up being a political allocation. California gets an extremely good deal. Nevada agrees to that without knowing that 20 years down the line, Las Vegas will start expanding and they will need much more water. So that to say that if I was Indiana and I thought, should I allow them to build a pipeline to California? I would be reluctant because I don't know whether, which is the time horizon that should allow that to happen. Plus, if we do that, and there have been, during the California crisis, everyone had a crazier proposal, right? There was this person who wanted to ship icebergs. This other person that was an actor, and I am blanking on their name, that come up with the idea of a pipe to the Pacific Northwest, submerged in the ocean, because that will imply less permitting roadblocks, that will bring water from Washington State to California. But none of those end up being implemented because it's very expensive. So you have to look at, when you are thinking about how to deal with water shortages, what are the sources available, with locally, and locally can be defined in different ways, and the cost of them. So now I live in Texas. In the area where I live, it turns out that the cheapest way to get new water is water reuse. Mostly indirect potable reuse, so you clean it by filtering the water through the ecosystem. So, the solution will be very much locally based or explained by the local circumstances.
Okay, gentlemen, next. Everyone, the queue is building, so be aware of that.
So going back to the issue that you mentioned of how it would be advisable to regulate surface water and groundwater jointly, you mentioned the example of Colorado, which has been doing this for a while apparently, and I was wondering what your take is on the practical issues that prevent states where water is already scarce today from switching to a model that integrates the two, and what you would do about some of these practical problems.
Well, I wish I had the solution. So there are several things, right? There are states today. Every Western state has a state water plan. Many of the states still don't know how much water is really being used, right? So they don't even have a good registry. And if you ask any economist, knowing who has water rights and for how much and how long, it's the first important step. But implementing that is not easy, right? So some states have an adjudication system where they have these special masters and courts that adjudicate water rights. They often only adjudicate time, not quantity, because, but it doesn't make sense, but it's very expensive and they last for years. And they bring all these, 19th century evidence from the newspaper and which crops were bought in that county and so on. So, if we have challenged just making people secure their property rights and bring information about those, imagine what it would be to revamp the system. California thought about, let me finish this thought. Then, if you wanted to regulate groundwater, particularly in a state that has not required a permit system, you could do one thing that we always do in environmental law, which is grandfathering everything, and then go from there. Right? So at least you will have to undergo the same system that you have underwent for surface water rights to groundwater in order to have at least an idea of who is using what and for how much. And this includes, and you then can decide what you leave out, right? In many jurisdictions, small wells for domestic consumption are outside the system. Whatever it is, you bring all those in. And then, what are the restrictions that you can put on those? And it will depend on the nature of those water rights. So some states have very old water rights that are more secure than permit systems that have been introduced afterwards. Again, I am talking a lot about California, but it's always the poster child for these things. So before 1904, all water rights were common law based. From 1904, there is a permit-based system. So obviously, you have more control over those permit-based systems than you have about historical property rights. In the last crisis, there was talk about you could still introduce some restrictions on these old water rights. The risk that you run as an agency is whether you will be liable for taking property. Of course, you have a solution, which is condemning those water rights, but I don't think there is any state agency that has the money to do that. So all the changes have to be incremental. They are not easy to implement, but some states have done it, right? New Mexico has tried to bring groundwater and surface water. Some other states have interesting systems like Oregon or Washington, even though their groundwater is less of an issue, but so on.
Okay, just to let everybody know what's going on, we have Rob, Tatiana, Nick, Lee, Tony so far. So Rob.
Yes, Vanessa and I spoke earlier today about regulation of water utilities as a natural monopoly, and one way to address the problem of concentration of too much resources in one entity is through that kind of regulation, through a kind of natural monopoly franchise. But during the course of your talk today, you've encouraged me to think bigger, right? So it makes me think of the role of the federal government, which historically in the water field is what brought us interstate movement of water through projects up and down, say, the Colorado River. And I could imagine a situation where the federal government enacts a statute, much like the Federal Power Act, that would try to jumpstart a market through regulation of interstate wholesale transactions, right? That's how the energy market works. We've got the states regulating their natural monopolies for retail sale of electricity, and the federal government has played a huge role in spurring greater competition in electric markets through its leverage over interstate sales. Now, obviously, there's a big problem because it costs so much more to move water than it does electricity. But one way to think about your question about, well, what would we need to do to spur greater competition and spur movement of more water to greater value areas would be to think about, well, what would it take on the wholesale market for, say, a regulatory regime that could make an order to promote the greater commodification, or at least preempt some of the state laws that are limiting transfers because of things like local basin protection and that sort of thing.
I mean, I have
Any
to
thoughts?
confess, this is bigger than I had thought, right? Because one thought that I had is actually looking at the Coastal Zone Management Act and the way that they have funds for states to implement plans and so on, that you could have something similar in order to promote at least, like some sort of inventory of water rights and groundwater and try to do it the soft way instead of what you were mentioning about the Power Act. And I think it's interesting, and it's not unthinkable, right? Because even though it's expensive to transfer water, especially when we are thinking of wholesale and large transactions, it may make sense to build infrastructure, but even if it doesn't, we have natural infrastructure that transfers water across states, and we run into all these problems. And for a long time, we have assumed that it was, two sovereign states agreeing, and then Congress rubber stamping. So how we have allocated interstate rivers is mostly, not only, but mostly, compacts between states that never get updated, and then you have litigation, and the Supreme Court pretends to understand water and comes up with a solution. So it may make sense for Congress to step in. And I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure I can see Congress stepping into this, but again, probably if I would have asked this a long time ago about energy, people would have thought the same way.
Hi, I'm Tanya, and I'm from the Department of Anthropology. So part of my project is related to the water infrastructure in the active conflict zone in Ukraine. And that's where my question is coming from. I would like to ask you to reflect a little bit on the controversy of water being a basic human right and a commodity. Because even though the business have this social responsibility, when during the emergencies such as hostilities, the transaction cost of water supply is raising so high, partially because of the damages to water infrastructure system, that the market can just collapse. And at the same time, water is essential for healthcare, for sanitation, and for larger idea of social well-being and welfare. So how does the idea of water markets and water regulation work in emergencies?
Okay, so several thoughts. One thing, and I was talking with Nikos earlier, that I have always had a hard time explaining is, and economists hate when I say this, and I know it's not even, I don't know how to state it, but people feel different about water, and there is something inherently public about water. And we have done the transition to pay more for electricity. I am not sure we will make that transition for water easily. We may buy a bottle of Evian for $3, but we may not want to pay for the water that comes out of the tap. But because we feel that we should be entitled to it. I guess that almost anything now, a lot of regulated markets deal with resources that we believe are necessary for our basic needs, right? Electricity, even telephone, or whatever you want to call it. And we still have more market activity than we do in water. So I do believe that markets can play a role, understanding that there is 2 to 5% of the water that should be allocated maybe not based on market principles. But that leaves a lot of room for the other 95% to be based on market principles. The problem is how you make these two regimes work together, right? And you can imagine that there will always be some sort of veto power or emergency power that the government should be able to trigger when they need to in order to satisfy the basic needs. I think water infrastructure is a little bit complicated because for a long time we have subsidized it. It has been part of, the government policies in order to develop certain areas, right? Bring water where there is none in order to have agriculture or a city or whatnot. This infrastructure is aging, and now governments don't have the funds, particularly in countries that may be developing, but even in the US, right? And then is when we turn to private companies. and how you set up some sort of control into these companies in order to ensure that they are providing reliable service, they are investing, and they provide water at a certain, at an affordable level. You have different systems that have worked, right? You could have just an agreement of them investing for a fee, and that's a fixed number, so they manage the water system, but they always get the same payment. You can make them ensure that everyone receives water or a certain amount of water for a certain price, and after that they can price it at any way they want. Of course, you could go full privatization, but that will not solve that issue. Right? If you go full privatization and the government steps out, you will not have any real control to fulfill the human right. So all are imperfect solutions, but I think we have good examples on how we can make that work. And again, this raises a lot of issues, right? If you remember the Cochabamba water wars, where you have privatization and the indigenous groups, and even not indigenous, fighting against it because they believe they are entitled to, that's a completely different issue that deals less with the amount of water or the feeling where the control should be.
Okay, Nick Lee and Tony.
Okay, so the conversation has kind of led to this question, which I don't know the answer to.
Probably, I don't either.
So, it sounds like fitting for the Ostrom workshop, local solutions are the proper way to go. But then there's been all these discussions about these regulations that do seem to be coming from on high. And there is a role for those, right? But I'm wondering, are the regulations that are coming from on high, are they facilitating, or are they just top-down solutions that are ignoring the knowledge problem in kind of imposing these things from the top down that are kind of inhibiting? So I'm thinking of like Bill Easterly's work on planners versus searchers. It seems like maybe what we have is we're kind of incentivizing the planners and inhibiting the searchers from being able to find it. Based on what I think you're trying to say is you want the proper regulatory setting that enables the markets to work the best that they can, given these things. So the question I have is that what's happening? Is the top-down federal, sounds like it's more state, but are we not going polycentric enough in terms of the regulations that are needing to take place? Because it sounds like we want these local solutions, but most of them sound like they're state level, which are going to not have proper knowledge to be able to solve these things at these smaller levels.
So it's a state level because historically water quantity has been regulated at the state level. And even if you think about the federal projects in the West, the Bureau of Reclamation is the title holder for state water rights that then it allocates. But I do think it's polycentric in the sense that, and I am not sure polycentric is good or bad here. So you have the regulation at the state level, but then a lot of counties or groundwater districts or irrigation districts have their own rules that may inhibit or enhance the market, and that will depend, right? So, for example, whether an irrigation district decides or not to sell water, and you can think about an irrigation district as an Ostrom Commons, right? And an irrigation district in California may have different rules than the Valencia and acequias that Elinor Ostrom look at, but it's the same concept. Like you have a board deciding and distributing water across farmers. How the voting rules work there may affect whether you can sell water outside or not, and what should we do? Should we just hope that they will come up with the best solution, or should we also have like a state regulating irrigation districts? So I am not sure I have an answer, but I am not sure a local common solution will solve the overall challenges, because what you may end up happening is less fungible water rights, right? If you come up with different solutions and different rules here and there, how you are gonna bridge, those differences.
I guess I'm trying to say, is it that we shouldn't have these state level ones? Is there a problem with some of the state level ones in kind of inhibiting the local solutions? Not let's get rid of the state level, I'm saying.
No, so I understand. I am not sure, I know, or I defend that there are solutions that, or changes that we should do at the state level. I am not sure which would be the places where, and cannot see anyone on top of my head, and there may be, but that where the state has to step out and let localities decide. And maybe California will prove me wrong with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, because you will have these single aquifer plans that allocate water in that aquifer, and maybe they will define water rights in a way that are fungible and transferable. But I think it's the other way around. If you are someone, and I do defend markets as a tool, not as the only tool, so in that I am deviating from the proposal that any economist will probably make. What you can see is that local solutions are creating extra transaction costs. So you have a lot of transaction costs at the state level, but then you have extra, like a county deciding that they don't allow the export of water, or the local community having to vote for the export of water. And I know it's a very imperfect answer to your question, but that's...
Okay, Lee.
Yeah, this has been helpful. When I read the paper, it's a very unusual paper for a law professor to write, because normally we hear, here's what you should do, and a whole bunch of normative stuff as to why we should do that.
Probably I will have to incorporate it
I'm
because I need
looking
to
at
get
Rob.
published.
I'm protecting him over here. I'm protecting him.
He's agreeing, I think. And economists are uneasy with that. But what yours was was kind of an econ take on it. Because, well, markets are great, but we got this problem and this problem and this problem. And at the end of the day, I wasn't sure, well, what does Vanessa think is the best way to help us get a better solution so water flows to its highest valued use? And I was thinking, well, gee, water's really different, as you said, where it's wet and where it's dry. It's also very different if you're using groundwater and tapping into the Ogallala aquifer.
Fine, yeah.
So maybe a way to help just frame the paper would be, okay, in wet states, here's maybe how markets should work. And in dry states, we should maybe do this. If people are relying on groundwater, they should be thinking about these things. I'm just thinking about how to get this to be a more what we should do kind of paper, if that's what you're headed towards. And you mentioned grandfathering in, and at first no one wanted to deal with fishing, and you couldn't get cod, and now cod's cheap and available, and it's come back off Iceland because of transferable quotas. And so a lot of times there's this resistance to what people think, oh, no one will ever do that. And then I thought, well, gee, if water's the new oil, we transfer oil
All the time.
all the time. And as you said, the basic needs one's pretty easy to deal with, right? Give it to them for free, Here's 5%, you get all this, and above that, you guys start paying. You want a fancy lawn, you pay. If you don't, so. But I guess I'm trying to get some boundaries because I wasn't sure what Vanessa thought.
Vanessa is not sure what she thinks, but it's true that they have to pick winners and losers. And I had this discussion with Rob this morning that I set up all these portfolio of measures, but I don't give any guidance of which ones are the best.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe a good way to sort of do this is precisely not necessarily pick an overall winner, and maybe I will need to, right? And that's part of what law professors do. But at least give you the variables that should explain whether you pick one or the other, right? It's water availability, or it may be if you are over a confined aquifer versus a non-confined aquifer, or and some of them may deal more with political economy issues than anything else, whether it's feasible or not.
Right.
I want to look more on ITQs, because the systems are very different in Alaska versus in the eastern fisheries and so on. And how they exactly because the grandfathering there, for example, in the Alaska fisheries is particularly interesting because they create this tier system where if you are a small vessel, you get this right. If you are a bigger vessel, you get this right, but you cannot transfer between the two.
Right.
So you make property rights less fungible,
Yeah.
but then you allow people, that allows you to make people buy into the system, right?
Exactly.
And
Yes.
so if I am incorporating here what Luis was asking is this feasible and how to make it feasible, probably some sort of transitional remedy, even it may be less ideal from a pure property rights perspective, may be better.
I mean, I think you've got a book here. I mean,
Sure.
to expand it. I mean, there's a
You
lot.
know, there is
here.
always this comment that law professors make. It's like, there are 2 papers here. It's always like in every single.
No, it's a book.
A book is even, it's different, right?
Tony, I think could be the last question.
Yeah, or I can catch you after, whatever you want to
I
do.
think, well, I
We
can
have
get
3
the
minutes, so
question.
I
Okay.
think you should.
So I guess at the start of the paper, you're comparing it to oil, which I thought, I mean, that kind of lures in the reader, but it seems like oil and a lot of other natural resources are different than water in that they're, I don't know, they're proven and then they're difficult to kind of replenish over time, right? So you have like an oil, so how does that make water different? And then right around page 40 and 42, you start talking about water as a human right, which I think is one of the more exciting things about it. And then when you're talking about, I mean, this goes to Lee's suggestion of a book. What happens if you're one of those 41 countries who do not think that it's a human right, right?
Including this one.
Well, I'm sorry?
Including the U.S.
Right. So then, but then you also talk about in some countries it's a duty that the government's supposed to, provide it. But what happens when the duty is on the person? So now you have these kind of legal right kind of frameworks that really I think would maybe alter your suggestions on the regulatory regime that you're supposed to have governing these things.
So, quick reactions. One is the renewable nature of water. It's always an issue, right? Because you cannot really regulate the whole cycle. Then that's why some states regulate rainwater cap. Actually, now I think it's legal in every state, but there are restrictions on rainwater capture and so on, right? So there are a gazillion things that you can regulate in the water cycle. But I think the problem is that even though it's renewable, it's still, there is not enough at any single point to quench all demand. So in that sense, it's similar, right? Like locally at least, like you have periods, you know that at some point it will rain again and we will have water and whatnot. But at some point, the supply and demand are mismatched and you have to find a solution for that issue. And it's true that you can store water and you can store electricity. So I could go resource by resource and highlight the difference and the commonalities and why it makes the regime different. I do think it's true that, and going back to Nick's question about, or actually Liz, about how to choose a winner or a loser, right, in the different proposals, the regime that you have may make some proposals easier to accept than others, right? If you have like a public property system over water, you may assume that if, for example, you have that in the Constitution and so on, that property rights are going to be weaker. And if they are weaker, you may be able to regulate more without facing a takings claim. So that may, prompt you towards more aggressive revamping of the system. Still, I do think that you see very few differences between jurisdictions. A lot of the US states claim that water is the property of the public, but that in the practice doesn't translate into that many differences. Most of them seem to be migrating towards a permit system that it's a property right, but it's not a full-fledged property right, and you have more agency intervention. So I do think it may make some solutions. So it may be one of the factors that I mentioned in order to choose winners and losers. But in practice, I see fewer differences in terms of the regime of water rights between states, no matter whether they claim water is a human right or not. It's true that even though there are no differences in how you regulate individual water users, there are differences on whether the state is liable or not if someone doesn't receive water, and how that liability is enforced. Right? You have interesting decisions that's a topic that is down your alley from the South Africa Constitutional Court about what does it mean to have a human right to water.
Vanessa, we're going to let Cyan have a very quick question, and we're going to.
Okay.
It's not even a question, it's a comment. As you expand this to a book, something to think about is all the work coming out of political science now on climate change and armed conflict, particularly around water rights. Colin Hendricks at the Corbell School in Denver is working on this. There's a bunch of new stuff coming out directly tying water access to armed conflict. And so it's a further expansion of what everybody's jumping on in terms of the human rights discussion.
Well, let's wrap it up and thank Vanessa.
Thank you.
That was the last colloquium for the year. We ended on a high note.
Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you.
You get to meet your son.
Get down there. So we'll be going back to the library. At the theater. Something must have been going on for about 20 minutes. I will email you, but I'm glad he told about it.
I will be around. My PM has been canceled.
Okay. I have.
Yes.
That was canceled. That was just yeah. Got a tech We've seen the building in yeah, that's what I was.